here is a collection of existing frameworks and work that people have done that I've put together to try and tell a story. So this is something that I discovered in my archives that I forgotten I had. Somebody did a piece of work about a transformative change cycle that says an organization to go through transformative change goes through different stages. Starts with unconscious and then awakening and then reordering, etc., and then it gets to integration. Now, looking at these stages, these places down here of doing something differently, getting the systems into line, etc., I get the sense that there's not much that we as a forum can do at that level. But we can do a lot about that in our individual programs. So we can't go out and collectively do interventions in the real world. That's not the way this kind of forum works. We need to do those in our individual capacities. But in this area of analyzing existing challenging underlying patterns, sort of holding up the mirror, formulating a vision from information, metaphors, personal visions, etc., so that individuals can then discover a personal fit. That's a place where we can work collectively. And if we do that collectively, then we can go and do the spade work in our individual interventions. Similarly, this is another framework. Sorry, I wasn't aware that there's animation on it that talks about education reform from Joseph de Stefano. And it says that we often focus on this part, the technical dimensions, on the pedagogy and the classroom management and school organization, curriculum and assessment. But that can only work if the other two elements are also addressed. So institutional dimensions of reform. So the institutional framework, institutional capacity, the resources, all of that needs to be in place. And in addition, this bit here, the political dimensions of reform. So the civil society and the politics and the leadership, and here, communication and political strategies for dealing with mental models and entrenched interests if conditions are to prevail at scale. Now again, these are the kinds of things that we do in our individual interventions, these two. But this won't work without this bit. And that bit needs to happen on a pretty large scale in the country for education to improve. And that is a place where I think we can collectively work in terms of shifting mental models and getting messages out there, etc. So from this framework I get to sort of a similar conclusion. Then there's Margaret Wheatley's famous self-organizing systems story that talks about, sorry, there was a bit here that I haven't seen now. There's a box here that I'm missing. But it talks about creating the conditions for self-organization to emerge. Because that's what we want, is for the bottoms up, for the social movement to happen. We're looking for self-organization. And the three elements of a self-organizing system is relationships. So the pathways of the system is how things are tied together and get synergy. It's information, so that's the growth medium of the system. So the self-organization feeds on information. And identity, the sense-making capacity of the system. Now in this forum we've been working on relationships, and we've done a lot of work on that, and we've been working with information, and we're looking in the mapping to do more of that, etc. So we're sort of active on that part, but if we want to get to the conditions for self-organization to emerge, this bit about the conversation about who we are, what could be possible, what is it that we value that goes with this identity and the sense-making capacity of the system. That's the part that's missing for me from what we want to, what we need for self-organization to kick off. So again, we get to having this feeding this conversation of what is possible and what can we do and what should we aspire for and who are we as a country and what does that take in terms of education. So again, that's something where I think there's a role for us to play collectively. So last time we talked about this thing of the system needs a growth mindset. So if we're saying that, okay, we want to work in the space of identity and affect and mindsets and valuing learning, etc., and formulate messages that we want to send out there and collectively try and get to take root, what would they be? And we've mentioned the one last time that talks about the growth mindset, and this is the one when I asked the neuroscience people what would they suggest that we do to shift. They said this is the thing that we must get embedded, is the idea that people have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And a fixed mindset said you're born with certain intelligence and that's it. And the growth mindset says that you can learn and grow. And that talent is a malleable quality and potential can be developed. And that has a lot of consequences, and there's a book by Carol Dweck about it, but it has consequences. So in a fixed mindset, people have to look smart at all costs because it's who they are. They're supposed to be clever, so they can't afford to look stupid. Whereas in a growth mindset, if you make a mistake, it's an opportunity to learn. It's not, doesn't touch your identity. And so there's some, and it works through in something as simple as how you praise learners. That if you tell them they're clever, you're embedding a fixed mindset. If you tell them they've worked hard, you're engendering a growth mindset. So these kinds of messages are things that I think we could put our weight behind. There was another one that I tried to open there to read to you, but we've been doing this project about workbooks. And the workbooks, when you look at the curriculum, there is an issue of whether the curriculum isn't too long. But there's also a major issue of how much energy is there in a classroom. And in the discussion in Cape Town, there was this thing that when you come out of university, you have to work to deadlines. But the pace at which people work and the level of engagement in the work in the classroom by itself makes that they don't cover all the curriculum that could be covered or extract all the learning that could be extracted. So this idea of that there is activity required and more energy and more speed in order to get to where we want to go as a country is another one of those messages. So we can identify a few of those, but I think it shouldn't be too hard to identify like 3 or 4 core messages that we want to put our weight behind. Now that's sort of a little bit of the mindsets and the what kind of thing that we wanted to could possibly chase. But now the second part is about sorts of how you do that. Because we want to influence behavior and policy, but in an open system where we want to get people where we don't have direct control over to do what we want them to do. We want voluntary adoption of a new way of doing, and we want to spread rapidly. So to get the idea of how to do that, I'm looking at ideas from what makes something go viral. If you look at the YouTube things, somebody wrote a book, and I've got a framework in here from that book. He went and studied 200 videos that went viral, and he said, what are the commonalities? What makes something have that just takes off? And you've developed a framework around that, and I'm going to go through that now. Or some of the thinking about memes, or environmental movement. There's some of the people have done lots of work about, if you think about 30 years ago, and you think about now, the level of penetration of environmental awareness in the general population, even though sometimes the facts are quite wrong, but the fact that there's a lot of, they called it social marketing at some stage, I think, of how you get an idea to spread. So there's those kinds of disciplines. And then there's some ideas from market penetration, innovation diffusion, etc. So I've stolen a little bit from all of them and put together something that says these are the kinds of things that you would have to look at if you wanted to do that. So last time I showed you this comes from Les Robinson, who has a career in change around environmental awareness and marketing and environmentally positive ways of doing. And he comes from Australia, but in different communities around the world. And he, over time, keeps on refining this model. Every few years you see there's a new one. But it's got the same idea of setting up a positive spiral, the reinforcing spiral that builds up and up and up and up and up. And this says, okay, you start with desirability. You must ensure that the behavior answers frustrated wants of the actors. If you want them to adopt a certain behavior. So it must, in some way, those he calls the Uber wants. Give them more control, give them more time, or assist their self-esteem in some way. And so that translates to more autonomy, more time, more respect, security, health, and predictability. Those are the basic wants. So the way that you pitch the thing must speak to these. Because if it speaks to any of these needs, people are more likely to want to do it. So that's step one. Then step two is to create an enabling context. So you must put things around it that makes it easy. So in the social or the technological or the physical or institutional context, there must be tools or the processes must be such, it mustn't be difficult. So if we take a particular message that we want to get out there, we will have to package it so that it speaks to all of these kinds of things. And it's no use if we tell people that they must now work for 10 hours instead of 8. It contravenes all of these principles. You have to find a better way of selling the idea than to tell them that now suddenly they have to go to school for 10 hours. And that will be the challenge. But if we can link it to these kinds of things, then it has a better chance of flying. Then the next one was the can-do thing. So that's the one thing you want people to be willing and able. And the able part has a lot to do actually by making it safe for people, the perceived risks of doing it. And we have to figure out, if we want to promote a particular message, that if people are going to adopt this, how can we make it safe for them that they don't get ridiculed? So we must make it cool. You must find some way of making it that there's social value in doing it. Then there's the bit about the buzz is making it contagious. That's a framework that I'll go to. That comes from the guy that looked at all the videos that went viral. But there must be like an excitement about it. People must be talking about it. And then there's an invitation, so an emotionally compelling invitation from a credible inviter. Must say, now let's do this. But it must be somebody that they can relate to. It doesn't help if it's somebody fancy that they don't relate to it anyway. That's why the credible comes in. And all of this has to happen before they will even try to do it. And then when they try to do it, then the results must be good. Because if they try it and it fails, then they're not going to try it again. So the trial needs to be satisfactory, and then they might try it again and again, and then you can get into a spiral. And then I'll speak to this other bubble here. So let's go a little bit into it. These are the kinds of things that they say you can worry about to make it sticky. So it's got a scale that goes from -5 to +5, and you just test your idea on it. So if you've got an idea, this is what you're going to do, then you could score it on these things, like control over outcomes that matter to them, time, it must be easier and quicker, the social value, the certainty, the compatibility, so it must be easy to fit into their lives complexity, easy to understand and do, and so on. If you've got high positive scores on this, you've got a good chance that it's sticky. If it's negative on all of these, you can forget it. It's not going to work. You have to rework it. The next one that I talked about is making it safe. Has to do with expanding the comfort zone. And you can use many of these, not just one. And you will see some of them I've grayed out. Because I don't think they're practical for a group like us. It's for organizational change maybe. But things like familiarity. So seeing someone similar perform the same actions, modeling it. Now in the messaging you can see ways of doing that. Telling the story of somebody who tried it and it worked. But let them speak, not you. Try it themselves in a safe environment, like detailed stories about how someone like them did it. They call them flight simulation stories. So he tells a story in one of the books, I think, of sending people to actually go and observe and then let them come and tell the story themselves when they come back. Then personal control, autonomy, so put people in control of the process. Now this is one that I think for our collective efforts won't work, but for the individual efforts, it's like they say that people who have severe pain use far less morphine when they're allowed to do it themselves than when they're not. When they have to ask a nurse to come administer the pain medication, or when they can themselves do it, they use far less if they have control over it. So they're more likely to do the positive behavior if they have control over it. Discussion with peers, goals and feedback, enjoyment. So it's quite a big thing in behavior changes to gamify it. Is to let people try it out in a game format, because it's no skin off their nose if it fails, and it's fun and it's much more likely to stick. Social proof, this is the important bit, that evidence that plenty of similar people are already doing it. I personally hate it when a salesperson comes to me and says, everybody's buying this one, because I don't want to be one of the crowd. But if it's about making it safe for people to try it, that is an argument. And then this commitment one is get people to commit to a small act that they can see that they pledge something or whatever, where they
skin in the game
in public. So they've now stood up, and it is a small thing, but just the fact that they've made this gesture where other people saw it is more likely to have to make them persist in doing it. And then there's some here at the bottom that I put very pale, like incentives. But incentives, are a two-edged sword. They more often than not incite the wrong kind of behavior. So that's why I put them very, very grey. And then the labeling one says you can tell people they are clever, and then they will behave in a clever fashion. Like the blue eyes and the brown eyes thing. As long as it's consistent with their self-image, and if they don't feel manipulated. So I think that's what is a risky one. That's why I graded it out. I don't think that's a real option for us. This was the framework that spoke about making a project or idea contagious. So this letter stands for social currency, triggers, emotion, public, practical value, and stories. So the social currency says, does talking about your product or idea make people look good? If you can get that, so you can make people feel like insiders, or in some way that it has social currency, that it in some way makes them more cool if they do this. Then the triggers, they say, is consider the context. What they mean is that, when something triggers you to tell a story, to tell somebody else, and you need to embed more of those triggers so that people tell the story more often. So you have to find ways of making people think of your story so that they say, oh, I must tell you about this new video that I saw, or this new thing that I heard. So build more triggers. Then emotion, focus on feelings. That's talking about your product or idea, generate emotion. That's always more convincing than pure logic. Does your product or idea advertise itself for public? Can people see when others are using it? If not, how can you make the private public? So when people adopt this thing, can other people see that they're doing it? Otherwise, if it's just only ever done in isolation, it's less likely to spread. And then the practical value is some altruism in the world. So that's talking about your product or idea, how people help others. So if, like I said, you know, if somebody has a problem, and say, you know what, I read the other day that if you do this and this and this, it will solve the problem. If you can in some way package it like it's, other people can help others with it, and packaging your knowledge and expertise into useful information, others will want to disseminate. So they want to tell other people about this clever thing that they found. And then this idea of the stories. What is your Trojan horse? So you can also not only depend on people telling them about your product or idea directly, but about a story of something that happened where your product is part of the story, but it's not the main theme of the story. That also helps. And it's a story not only viral, but also valuable. So those are ideas that come from how do you make things go viral. And then this little bit here is, you know, the innovation adoption life cycle that talks about innovators and early adopters and early majority and late majority, etc. If you want to hook your message into the needs of people, you must understand that these different categories of people have different needs. So it maybe initially you get all the early adopters, and then you say, okay, the enthusiasm is waning now. Then you must understand that the pragmatists have a different set of needs, so you have to repackage your message to speak to those needs, so you have to reinvent your message. So sometimes when it starts losing momentum, it's just because you've now reached all the early adopters, you now have to reach the pragmatists. And the pragmatists are the ones, I mean, I'm an early adopter, I don't want to hear on some things. I don't want to hear that 100 other people are using it. I want to do something different. So telling me that won't help. But if you talk to a pragmatist, they only do things once they've been shown to be effective and everybody is using them, it's fine. The risk is low, I can go there. So when you want to reach a pragmatist, you have to say, but this thing is working, it's safe, you can do it. And if you want to get the conservatives, it's another set of rules. So you must say, and here by the time you get to the laggards, you have to tell them, listen here, you're going to get fired if you don't do it. So the needs are different for each group, and therefore you have to package the message differently. And very often that's all that's needed to rejuvenate a change campaign, is that you must shift the gear for the next group. So that's sort of what I put together in terms of a set of frameworks that together can help us guide how to package, what we must take into consideration. If we can identify what the things are, then taking these principles into account, we can package them in ways that will help, hopefully, them fly.